So today we're focusing on practical steps to finding forgiveness. It's a great way to finish this series on renewal as well, which I understand has been the focus of the talks for Orthodox Cafe this last little while. I think when we think about what it means to live in a Christ-like way, really forgiveness is at the very core of that. And alongside the sacrament of confession, it's probably forgiveness that is essential to the ability for us to renew our hearts and our minds and souls, slowly shedding our old self as we become more like Christ. So with forgiveness comes peace of mind and peace within our hearts and a sense of freedom, and it allows us to live with the same heart that Christ did when he forgave and continues to forgive us. So it's a great way for us to focus on probably everything that everyone's learned over the last few weeks of talks and to really hone in on what it means to find renewal within ourselves. So let's launch in. Christ instructs us, do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven, in Luke chapter 6, verse 37. And that's all easier said than done. Truthfully, growing up, I thought of myself as being someone who was very forgiving. And I thought it was baffling to me when other people would hold grudges or they would be resentful over things. I just couldn't understand why they would do that. It seemed so silly to me to hold on to something that was really only affecting you. Your grudge or your resentment wasn't making an impact on the other person. But I think thinking that way as a younger person was pure arrogance on my behalf, because I just hadn't been tested yet. And as I got older, and particularly as I entered my 20s, I had a number of different experiences that really tested my ability to forgive. And that was really humbling, I suppose, because it also enlightened me on what Christ's forgiveness really cost for us and how hard it is for other people to forgive as well, now that I understood just how much and how taxing that process can be. So as I was tested and have been tested and probably will continue to be tested in my adulthood, I began to realize I was more often than not failing those tests. And I was learning a lot through those failures. So this talk is a sort of summation of those experiences, as well as the really great advice I'd been given by my spiritual elders and counselors and spiritual fathers over the last few years. So I hope that everyone has something that they can take away from this as well. At times, I definitely did judge and I definitely did condemn the people who'd hurt me. And worse still, I did curse them. And I think what God was trying to do in those instances was teach me the value of forgiveness and why it is essential to our salvation and essential to becoming more like Christ. So perhaps like me, you have had experiences, and it's very likely that you've had, that have tested your ability to forgive. And if you haven't yet, it's likely they're coming. It's one of those things that I don't think we'll get to the end of our lives until we've been tested in this way, because it's really what refines our ability to love. So that's why we're giving this talk today. It's an opportunity for all of us to consolidate our experiences, our knowledge, what we've learned in our lives about the wisdom and the process of forgiveness and what that process looks like. So let's jump in. One of the best pieces of advice I was given in recent years by a spiritual father was that the first step to forgiving is accepting that there are stages of forgiveness. And just like there are stages of grief, there are stages to forgiveness as well. And it isn't something you can achieve overnight. Once somebody who had really betrayed my trust sought forgiveness from me. And I told them almost immediately, of course, I forgive you. And I meant it intellectually. The rational part of my mind did forgive them. I didn't see what point there was in holding a grudge. And from an objective perspective, I understood that the hurtful things they had done were not really about me. It was sort of a manifestation of their own, weaknesses or their own issues that they were having. And I became the target. So it didn't make any sense for me to hold a grudge. But despite the fact that I'd intellectually gone through that process, I had said I'd forgiven that person, I just couldn't move forward from that exchange. I found myself mulling over that experience of betrayal over and over again. And that was probably a reasonable response. I had been hurt and I'd been disrespected. Their actions went on to color the way that I view other people for the rest of my life. But it didn't hit me until a while later I really had to nurse my wounds, and, I really had to cry about it and get angry about it. And I just found myself though rinsing and repeating those two steps over and over, the crying about it and getting angry about it. And it was really frustrating to me. And it was in that emotional landscape, I found myself quite lost and wandering around in circles. And I had said that I'd forgiven that person, but every time I saw them, or even thought about them and that crossed my mind, I would feel that resentment again. And it felt like I was sewing a wound shut, only just to pick it open and pick open at the scabs again and again. So it wasn't healing. And I had never been in that situation before. I approached my spiritual confessor about it, and he gave me some really great advice. He said, you will know, well, firstly, he said, you have already forgiven that person because you've said you've forgiven them. You want to forgive them. You now need to work on being patient with yourself until you get to the point you could treat this person as if they were a total stranger. And then that's when you know you've moved on from this. And it was excellent advice for a variety of reasons. The first is that it made me realize forgiveness is a process. And it starts with that intellectual or that sort of objective choice that you are making a decision to forgive. And sometimes that choice itself will bring up a great deal of resistance. It may feel impossible to forgive, and there'll be people who will resist even the thought of forgiving, in which case you sort of have to start even below ground zero, if that's how you feel. And you have to begin praying for a willingness to forgive, and a softening of your own heart, so that if you ask for the grace to be willing to forgive, at least that opens the door to you then making that decision to forgive. Sometimes you have to start that at that stage or at that place. But the point being, it is sort of like building a house. You have to have a foundation, and then you have to move up in that process. It doesn't happen overnight. So what I gained from that experience was that forgiveness isn't something that you can just flick on like a switch. If it was that, it would be meaningless and it would have no value because it required no sacrifice from yourself then. So it becomes something that you have to be patient with yourself and to move through the different sort of stages of forgiveness to reach reconciliation or wisdom or peace. And when you reach those experiences, you attain a sense of renewal. But then it's worth saying what forgiveness is and what it is not before we continue, because I think that's why I struggled so much. I thought forgiveness was just that sort of choice, that objective choice to forgive. And I was then very much struggling with the fact that I couldn't move on emotionally. So forgiveness is sort of the process of transitioning from feelings of resentment, bitterness, vengeance, anger, whatever it might be, hurt, to peace by pardoning an offense. And in the Bible, the Greek word for forgiveness literally means to let go, as in when a person does not demand payment for a debt. Which I think is a really interesting way to think about forgiveness as it being a debt that you've forgiven or a debt you've written off, that you're not expecting a payment for. You're not expecting anything in return. However, we should also say that forgiveness does not condone the person's behavior, and it does not absolve them from their responsibility, because forgiveness is actually a process that's about us internally and not the other person. It's about how you choose to respond and how you respond to that person's behavior. Will you carry around what they did, like lead weights on your ankles, or will you cut them free so that you can have peace of mind and peace in your heart? And forgiveness is about your ability to heal, to stop picking at your wounds. And I think that's important too, because really, if you think forgiveness is a process of condoning or excusing an offense or pretending the offense did not happen, which I think a lot of people think forgiveness sometimes is, or impeding the consequences of an offense, that's almost like the opposite of forgiveness, because you're then putting yourself in the seat of the person with judgment. You're the person who then judges. Only God can really put themselves in that position and absolve somebody of a sin. It's not for us to do that. It's for us to let go and to not demand or expect a particular retribution or response. So I think it's important to sort of realize and put aside that you yourself aren't going into the experience with expectations of either absolving or condemning the person. Forgiveness is more about yourself than it is about the other person. It's the letting go so that you can move forward without anything hanging on into your heart. So once you've taken that first step to forgive, you're simply, the way I like to see it or put it now is that you're simply opening the door to your own healing. And we walk through that door into a series of rooms. Each of those rooms contains a different response or emotion. You know, it might be grief or pain or anger, it might be bitterness or rage, but each room, whatever rooms are in your floor plan, needs to be traveled through. And God intends for you to travel through those rooms in order to teach you something, in order for you to gain a deeper sense of wisdom. Because the ability for us to love is when we're able to feel these things and put them aside. Otherwise, again, love isn't really love. It's without meaning and it's without sacrifice. So if we're thinking of forgiveness as the floor plan and we're moving through each of those rooms, each of us will have a different sort of floor plan with a different set of rooms to move through. You might not experience any anger or any bitterness, but you might feel deeply betrayed and deeply sad, and it will require you to still move through your own journey. But nonetheless, each room must be traveled through. Moving through those rooms does not negate your ability to forgive, but you mustn't stop in any of the rooms. And I think that's the really hard part about the process of forgiveness. And that's where we often fail, is that we can sometimes get into one of these rooms and sit in there and pace in there and refuse to leave. So I think for us, it's more about resisting the temptation to dwell in any of these states of mind, to spend your time mulling over pain or resentment or whatever it might be. Taking up any kind of residence in any of these rooms is a real threat to your salvation. So while it's important to travel through them, you can't stop in any of them. And you can move through them as slowly as you need to and be patient with yourself. But there's a real danger when you find yourself sort of digging your heels into any one of these different emotions and refusing to progress or move on. And it takes a great amount of self-awareness. And of course, that's why we have spiritual fathers and other people in our lives who can point to us when we are lacking that self-awareness, to know when we're digging our heels in and we're kind of getting stuck in any one of these different headspaces or emotions. So nonetheless, you must go through these different various emotions, whatever it is that might appear for you in this cycle, and experience them and then let them go. Because if you don't, you can't actually acknowledge and accept what has happened. And I think for me, with in terms of forgiveness, it's almost inevitable you will at least experience a sense of indifference where what that person's done no longer bothers you, and that of course is what allows you to find peace. And I think that's what my spiritual confessor meant when he said, when you can see this person and you treat them like a stranger, that's when you find peace and you know you've moved on, because that indifference is actually necessary in order to love everybody equally. You almost need to have that kind of indifference where you're not holding faults or anger against the other person. So I think once you reach a point of understanding, you kind of come to a space of indifference, and then that allows you to find peace. It may take a while to do this. You know, for some people it might take a week, and for some people it might take years. But I think it's sort of like the expression, time heals all wounds, but I would say that it's actually not time that heals the wounds, it's patience. And God may allow us intentionally to progress very slowly through these emotions in order to strengthen our patience and our resolve and our endurance, and allow us to mature more fully in our spirituality. So long as you keep moving, you will find the last room and you'll enter the last room, which is peace. So I think that was a helpful way for me to approach that process, and to stop being so, I suppose, resistant, because whenever I found myself in any one of these different headspaces, I would kind of beat myself up and think, oh, I'm failing, I'm not forgiving. And that wasn't helpful. It wasn't actually allowing me to come to a point of acceptance and to take lessons away from the experience, which is what God ultimately does with every bad and good experience we have in our lives, is to teach us something about ourselves so that we can become more like Christ. So now that we have the floor plan out of the way, what not to do? I think it's helpful when we're talking about practical steps to anything, but particularly something like forgiveness, to not just look at what to do, but to look at what not to do. So we've got the very wise words of Saint Silouan, and I think he puts it far better than I ever could. So we'll have a look at what he has to say. But he says, a soul that is nurtured by hatred towards man cannot be at peace with God, who has said, if you forgive not men their sins, neither shall your Father forgive your sins. If a man does not want to be reconciled, you must at least guard yourself from hating, praying with a pure heart for him, and speaking no evil of him. And there are a few really important things to note from these words of wisdom. Saint Silouan says that if a man does not want to be reconciled, and this tells us that forgiveness can lead to reconciliation with someone, but that's not always the case. And sometimes people will not be reconciled. And sometimes when relationships are broken beyond repair, that's the natural course of events. A person's hurtful actions, once they've been revealed, changes the relationship, and it may no longer be spiritually beneficial for those two people to remain in a relationship, whatever that relationship may look like, whether it's a friendship, whether it's with family, whether it's just an acquaintance, or, you know, a boss, whoever it may be. It may come to the point where you realize it's actually detrimental to your own salvation to try and reconcile. But that doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't part on loving terms or part in a loving way. However, if we want peace with God, we have to seek forgiveness, even if we aren't seeking reconciliation. That's what this passage really says to us. So what does that mean? If forgiveness isn't the actual action of repairing a relationship, then what exactly does it look like? Because that sounds quite abstract. We fortunately do have a list explicitly which tells us what forgiveness is and isn't, which is found in the letter to the Ephesians. And it says, get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving of each other, just as Christ God forgave you. I think that's such a great passage. It's got pretty much everything in there that you'll need. When you're in that process of forgiving and you're moving through your emotions or the different rooms in your floor plan, it's very hard to exercise self-control, which is one of the virtues that is most important to a Christian. Satan will try and use your emotions to stir up a reaction, and that will cause you to sin, and that will create more damage. And it's sort of like Satan's signature move, I guess. It's very easy to manipulate somebody who's hurt to hurt other people. So there is a saying, and I'm sure many of you have heard it, that refusing to forgive is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. That is literally what bitterness, rage, and anger does to you. It's not in any way affecting the other person. It's affecting you. It's a double-edged sword, and those emotions will destroy you before they can ever even touch the other person. So when we move through those different emotions, we have to be careful those emotions don't become actions. And that's basically what the remainder of the list is talking about, right? Because bitterness, rage, and anger, when acted upon, become brawling, slander, and malice. So the next thing on the list, brawling or physical fighting. If your resentment leads you to a headspace or a place where you're so out of control, you physically want to hurt the other person somehow, whether that be in a fight or whether that be through some sort of like act of revenge, in order to get even, or however you've justified those actions. Like really, there's nothing that needs to be said. It's quite literally the opposite of what Christ did, who he chose to put himself on the cross. He chose to experience punishment for our sins. So when you think about this idea of wanting to hurt somebody else to get even, it's contrary to everything that a Christian stands for. We're taught as Christians to turn the other cheek or will walk away rather than raise a fist. And I think that's really important in these situations, to be in control of yourself so that doesn't happen. And it's the same with the rest of the list. And probably more likely, at least I've never got into a physical brawl, but I definitely have been somebody who's slandered. And if we were to define slander, which is what, Saint Silouan is warning us against here. It's basically bad mouthing someone, right? I think a lot of us, when we're angry, do this. It's when we think something's unjust or we've been hurt by someone, it's very easy to try and pull someone's reputation down by spreading that around to others. And it's a very different thing to say if you were to alert somebody of somebody else, if you were to alert somebody who may be vulnerable or that's experiencing something you have, because your intention is very different in that situation. Your intention isn't to harm the other person who's hurt you, it's to protect someone. Whereas when you're slandering or bad-mouthing, your goal is to sort of destroy the other person's reputation. It's an entirely malicious motive. And I think that in itself, when again, you have that self-awareness, you know that is the antithesis of what Christ would have done and how Christ lived. So once again, it comes back to us needing to be patient with ourselves in that process of forgiveness, but also doing everything possible to avoid engaging in any of these behaviors while we're in that process, because that's where the real test is. That's what the test of forgiveness is your ability to control yourself when you're going through and moving through this experience of these emotions, so that you don't engage in these behaviors. And lastly, I think the most important thing is to reframe our perspective. When Christ was on the cross and bearing our sins and being crucified by the people who were taking pleasure in his pain, he cried out, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they are doing." It's kind of one of the most emotional moments in the week of Holy Lent, when we have that particular service on Good Friday, and you think, well, for Christ to cry that out and to say that, I come back to that almost daily, or in any experience where I've been personally wronged. Because I think that statement is truly a revolutionary way to think. Because realistically, if we zoom out and we come at this from a less, myopic and personal response, we're all victims of victims, and we are all slaves to sin. And that doesn't condone people's sins or our own sins. And we are still responsible for our actions and their consequences. But it does explain why we do the things that we do. And it puts things into a different perspective, because even the very worst person who is cruel or abusive or dangerous or hurtful, they're very likely a product of a dysfunctional environment and indulgent in their own passions. And they're so ruled by those things that they are the victims of their own cycles of abuse. And that's why they spew these things into the world. So again, that doesn't condone their behavior. I'm not saying that makes it okay, but it does realign the way that we view these people. And it does make us, rather than hate them, it makes us sort of pity them. It makes it all the more important that we should pray for people who are our enemies and not sort of want to hurt them or get vengeance. And it also reminds us that we are all truly capable of doing horrific things. And that's a really hard thing to grapple with, I think, for many, that when we are enlightened by grace, that light kind of awakens within us a desire to do better and to be better for our neighbors and our enemies. And that awareness makes us think twice about committing a sin or hurting somebody else. But a person enlightened by love is aware of the weight of their actions. Whereas a person that is within darkness, they don't actually see the consequences of their own actions. So it changes the way that we view things. We kind of understand that the reason people more often than not are hurtful or do things that we do find like reprehensible, the reason for that is because it's coming from a place of darkness and ignorance, and they themselves don't even understand the consequence of what they're doing, because they're not enlightened with grace and love. And that's why we're to pray for our enemies. That's the very reason. So when we forgive, of course, we're not excusing others. Only God can excuse that, or excuse what a person has done. And only when that person has genuinely repented with humility to God. So that's something we can't have a say over. However, forgiveness is the offering of inner peace with the presence of the Lord, and allowing a spiritual and psychological renewal and well-being to take place. And in some instances, forgiveness can bring about the healing of a relationship, especially when you've reframed your perspective and you understand what motivated that person is something that could very easily have motivated you as well. And in other cases, it can only bring about inner healing, because that other person, for whatever reason, it may just not be conducive to your own spiritual journey to remain in a relationship with them. Or it just may be that person, you've forgiven them, but they're not really seeking reconciliation, or they have not sought to change or repent in their behaviors. So it almost seems counterintuitive to then continue to be in any kind of relationship with them. So in order to let go of those resentments, it means letting go of the relationship, and that's okay as well. And earlier I mentioned the advice of my spiritual confessor. When I learned to treat this person as they were a stranger, then I've truly moved on. And I think that means that if I bumped into that person, I would treat them exactly as I would treat a stranger in the street. I wouldn't go out of my way. I would be polite. I would say hello, but I also wouldn't ignore them, because I wouldn't be feeling anything out of the ordinary. And I think that takes a great course of time to get to that point. But there's incredible power in being able to do that as well. It's the power of grace in action, because to treat them as any other human being, and hopefully due to my mission as a Christian, that means any of my behavior towards any human being is one of love. So I think that's what it comes down to. When you view them as any person, then you're viewing them as an icon of Christ, and whatever resentments may have been there get put to the side. But the most important thing to remember is that there are people you have crossed paths with, or I have crossed paths with, and we will all do this at some stage, and they will feel this way about us, and we will be the cause of their resentments, and we'll be the cause of their bitterness. And that's such a horrible thing to think, that many of us have probably been in that situation without even realizing it. We may have hurt people or really, really affected people, and we're ignorant of the fact that we did that, and we wouldn't even know we needed to seek forgiveness. And again, that really reframes our perspective. When you realize that you yourself we're all guilty of that. It kind of reminds you that you can't hold grudges or resentments against others when we ourselves are probably very likely the cause of somebody else's bitterness or, resentment or hurt or pain. So none of us are immune, and we have all given people struggles to find forgiveness, just as we have struggled to find forgiveness. But before concluding, I did want to open up to a bit of a discussion with everyone, because I think there's value in us sharing our experiences here. I did want to finish on a note, actually. Once my spiritual father said to me, I always butcher this when I try to share this anecdote, so I hope I say it correctly. But he had somebody who was sitting in confession who was saying, I obviously didn't know the context because he did tell me, but they were refusing to forgive someone. And so despite this priest trying to urge them to, and so he said, fine, in that case, I can't read, I can't read the final prayer for confession because you haven't confessed anything, like you're refusing to forgive, but let's just finish with the Lord's Prayer instead. So they stood up to say the Lord's Prayer. And when this priest got to the line that was, and forgive us as we forgive those who sin against us, he intentionally said, and do not forgive us as we do not forgive those who sin against us. And the person with him stopped him and said, why would you say that? Like, why would you say that to God during this prayer, like during the Lord's Prayer? And the priest said, well, isn't that exactly what you've done today? He said, that's what happens. Going back to that very first Bible verse that we started this talk with, we are judged the way that we judge others. And I had a moment of real reckoning with this man who apparently immediately apologized and said, I'm going to go make this right. I'm going to go and speak to that person and forgive them. Because it reminds us that we are forgiven in the way that we forgive others, just as Christ forgave us. That's the standard we're held to, which is a hard standard, but is also an incredibly freeing standard, to know that if we are merciful to others and we unlock what it means to be merciful and loving, that we experience that mercy tenfold, is an incredible thing. So I thought we would finish on a note with some discussion. I did also want to say, sorry, I keep saying we're going to finish with discussion and then I have something to add, but I promise this is the last thing to add. I just thought it was interesting because while doing a bit of research, some people may be familiar with the 5 love languages, or the 5 ways. It's something that a psychologist once put together, I think he was a psychologist, Dr. Gary Chapman. He put together a novel called The 5 Love Languages, which express the different practical sort of ways that people show love. That's not what this talk is, and you can research that at another time. But he did also write a book with somebody else called Jennifer Thomas, called The 5 Languages of Apology. And I thought that was really interesting when I was doing my research, that we do express our apologies in different ways. And it obviously has a similar framework to the original book for those familiar. But the 5 apology languages are expressing regret, accepting responsibility, making restitution, so trying to make amends, genuinely repenting, and requesting forgiveness. And I won't go into these because they're basically a different talk altogether. I think seeking forgiveness is very different to finding it. But I did want to recommend maybe doing a bit of reading into it in your own time, or maybe putting aside a talk for it in another time, because I think when we understand the value of seeking forgiveness, we become better at forgiving others as well. I think that's sort of a process that we go through within life. And I hold this opinion as well with the 5 love languages. I think as Christians, we should be making an effort to perfect all of these. It's not enough for us to say, oh, I think my style of apology is I like to express regret and move on. Okay, that's cool. But I think really, if you're a Christian and you're committed to becoming as loving as possible, I think it means trying to learn how to truly and genuinely love, and to obviously apologize or seek forgiveness. And that might mean putting into practice one of these 5 methods that is your least favorite. Maybe you hate accepting responsibility. Maybe that's the one part of the forgiving, seeking forgiving process you resist. So perhaps that's where you actually need to work the most. And that's what God's intention is for you to perfect that. So it's just something to go away and think about. It's something I certainly took away. I was like, oh, this is interesting. I would like to learn how to speak all 5 languages of apology, I guess. All right, now I did want to open up for a little bit of discussion before we finish completely. I'm going to flick to the last little discussion section. Usually I give various scenarios, but this time I wanted to do something a bit different. I basically wanted to put it to everyone here today and hear your opinions. If you have tried your best to forgive somebody and you still find whenever you see or you interact with this person, it stirs up fresh resentments, and it's someone you can't avoid. So say it's your boss, or it's somebody you see every week at church, or it's somebody you work with. So despite the fact that you would probably choose not to continue to be in their presence, it's unavoidable. How might you deal with that? How might you practically stop yourself from dwelling in any of those unpleasant rooms or emotions so that you can find forgiveness? What might you do as a strategy or a way to deal with that? Would anyone like to volunteer first? I think, is somebody on mute but talking? Or maybe not, maybe not. Sorry. I don't want to put you on the spot if you're not answering the question. Sorry.
Do you know, hi.
Hi.
I'm Helen.
Hi, Helen.
Really nice talk. I think one of the most important things is to acknowledge your feelings, even if they're negative, because that way then you can move a little bit forward after you acknowledge at least that you're not going to be in a very favourable mindset when you're with that person.
I think that's true. I think that was the process that I was finding most difficult in the beginning. And that's why I sort of moved to that metaphor of the floor plan, because I think when we don't acknowledge how we feel, we just kind of sit inside of it. Whereas when you acknowledge it, you go in circles. That's right. When you're acknowledging how you're feeling, it sort of allows you to step outside of the emotion, and like it gives you a little bit of a separation from it. So you're not as likely to stir it up or to dwell on it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's good advice.
So I think that's important to start off with. Acknowledge, and it's okay to feel what you're feeling, and then from there say, well, is that the right way to move forward, or do I need to change my way of thinking? But at least if you don't see it, then you can't go to the next level.
Absolutely. Good advice, Helen. That's brilliant. Very good advice.
Next, someone else.
Does anyone else have any thoughts that you'd like to share of a way you might what strategies you might use if it's somebody you can't avoid, that you've tried to forgive but you feel like it stirs up bitterness or anger when you see them? What strategies might you use to deal with that? Yes, I can see a hand up.
Well, it depends on the person, really, because a lot of people, when offended, would take it deeply, and no matter how many times you try, and if they want to forgive you, it's hard for them. And if they say something rude to you and you say, yeah, I forgive you, it might be easy for you, but not for them. So it just really depends on the person and the situation that it happens.
I agree. And I think that's why it's important for each of us to seek advice from our own spiritual fathers who know us, and they know the way we operate, and they can give you advice that best suits you. As well as, like, if you have trusted friends who can advise you, or other sort of, people you look up to who can give you that advice, it's helpful to have that, because I think what it comes back to is awareness and experience. The more that we build up our ability to forgive, the more wisdom we get from those experiences. So sometimes it's helpful to ask other people as well. We lack what would work best for us. We don't know what would work best for us because we're kind of going through it for the first time. And when we do seek advice from other people, it can benefit to give us a bit more awareness in that practice, for sure. Absolutely. No other takers for this particular question?
Oh, I'll say something.
Yes, please.
So I guess when I find that I'm like stuck in one of those rooms, I find it helpful to just remind myself that God forgives me every day, or has forgiven us for everything that we do, for all of our sins, because we're all sinners and we've all done something against him. And, his love is so great that he can forgive us, so I can forgive this one person. And I also think that what you said as well at the beginning of the talk, where that resentment and that bitterness that you have, it only affects you. It's not going to affect that person. So why not just let it go? It's not going to affect that if it's something to do with, wanting to get revenge on this person, that you think that anger you're holding on to is what's going to, I guess, affect, I don't know, flow into that person somehow. It doesn't. It's like what you said, you're drinking your own poison and hoping the other person will be affected by it. So I find that really helpful to remember as well.
I agree. I think that reframing of perspective is so important. I'm not sure which saint said it. It's from a talk I gave like years ago, like 2018, but I once read something and essentially came to the point of, it was about mindfulness, and it came to this point that every single thing that comes into our life, it might have actually been Saint Paisios, every single thing that comes into our life, we can choose whether we view even the most troublesome and the most difficult of people as like blessings from God, because we can see that those people, when they really stir up in us anger or resentment or frustration, we can say, thank you, God, for sending me this person to teach me patience, or thank you, God, for sending me this person to sort of teach me how to be a little bit more resilient, or a little bit more wise, or a little bit tougher, because sometimes we need that too. We need to learn how to have thick skin. So it is a matter of perspective. And I do agree. I think that's a really good way to view it, is that we all fall into sin, all of us. And like we said earlier, all of us are guilty of being probably the object of somebody else's resentments. so I think it keeps things in a good frame of mind for us to reframe. When we are around somebody, it's unavoidable. Unfortunately, we cannot separate from them, and they do stir up those feelings on a regular basis. At the very least, we can, really work within our own minds and our own souls to try and reframe the way we think, because maybe that's why God's put this person in our path. And I'm a big believer in, once you pass the test, it's kind of like at school. If you keep failing a test, you have to resit it again and again. And the moment you pass the test, God's like, great, I'm taking that paper away. You passed. Here's a harder paper. And you move on to the next challenge. So I think he'll keep you in that situation as long as you need to be there to learn the lesson you need to learn. And once you've learned it, you'll move on to the next challenge. That's what life's like. But I think is it Linda? Is that right? Yeah, really good way to see it. I agree. If everyone's happy for me to give one more little discussion point, unless anyone wants to jump in with a thought on this last one. Yes, Father, go ahead.
Vanessa, thank you for the talk. It was great. I remember what St. Porphyrio said, that we spoke about a few weeks ago, that when these thoughts attack you, then it's important to not give them much credence as well, because otherwise that's what the devil wants too, that he wants us to give more emphasis to these things, and so that they continue to bother us and disturb us. So that's something that I remember he spoke about, and also he spoke about the importance of prayer as well. Once you're attacked with these thoughts, to go straight into prayer, and he used the Jesus prayer, especially when he was attacked from thoughts about anger with someone. Straight away he would say, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, and that's how he would deal with it. So I think those points from St. Porphyrios, they're very important actually in that book. I recommend it to everyone, Wounded by Love.
Wounded by Love. It might, I'm trying to remember, it may have been St. Porphyrios who made that comment. It's either St. Paisios or St. Porphyrios who made the comment about thanking God for the people who come into our lives to bring us, to challenge us, is probably the best way to put it. I agree, Father. I think that's very well put, and obviously a key part of finding forgiveness is our ability to disrupt thoughts that stop that process. And we're very lucky that we have the tradition of our church, which teaches this. I mean, modern psychology's only really started teaching it in the last 100 years, but the Orthodox Church has taught it since the beginning. So we're very lucky to have this incredible tradition to fall back on as well, and build our own ability and knowledge. And I wanted to ask about one more scenario as well, because I think this is a good one to finish on. It's about this idea of closure. And I've sort of formed my own opinions on this now, because I've given this talk so many times, but I think it's interesting to hear others as well. So let's just say the scenario is somebody who really hurt you, perhaps years ago, like in high school, like a bully or somebody who was really cruel to you, has contacted you many years later. They once had driven you to a very dark place, but you've moved on from that. It was over a decade ago. but they've sent you a message, maybe on Facebook, saying they'd love to meet up with you to seek forgiveness for their actions. And they've realized how horrible they once were to you. But you are concerned that if you did see this person, it's just going to open up old wounds, and you've already forgiven and moved on. So what might you do in that sort of situation where somebody's contacted you? Do you think closure is necessary for forgiveness? And where do we find closure? Do we find it in others? Do we find it from God, from ourselves? Yes, Arsenius's hand is up.
Well, I just remembered that you gave this exact talk to St. George.
Yes, you're one of the people that were there. I hope
beginning of the year. I can repeat the answer I gave last time. I was actually bullied in high school for a long time, from year 7 to year 10. And the person who bullied me was one of the seniors. He gave me this nickname, and the whole school called me that. They all knew my actual name, but instead of calling my actual name, they decided to call me the name that he called me. And so that was my life in high school. And so, I don't know, like years after that happened, I'm at old church and he rocks up with his girlfriend. And I saw him, even though he bullied me throughout high school, I greeted him like a friend. I shook his hand, we shook each other, we said, hello, how are you? How have you been? And the thing is, I forgave him when I was in high school. Like, I don't know if he knew that. I don't know anything, but bygones be bygones. I mean, it was after so many years, and seeing him at church, I felt like I wanted to confront him and all that, but I couldn't do it. And I just pretty much, when I shook his hand, that's when I knew that all was forgiven.
That's such a great story. Thank you for sharing it again. It comes to the core of, I think, that advice that I was given applies perfectly here, of when you can treat that person like you would treat anyone else, that means you've truly forgiven and moved on. And for you to be able to do that, you've treated him as a friend or as any other person, that you've greeted from your past, shows that you've that's the definition of, I suppose, renewing ourselves and being able to move on. What an incredible test of your own strength, I think, Arsenios. But it is one of those things that's hard at the same time. I suppose if you feel like you've sorted, like you don't need to see this person, you don't need to go out of your way to see them, to seek to forgive them. Is it necessary for you to meet up with them again? Is it necessary for that to take place? Or is it enough for you to just say, do you know what, to respond to that message and say, it's fine, you've been forgiven a long time ago. I think seeking closure, I can see someone nodding very strongly there, which I have had the same realization. I used to be really big on wanting closure from people, but I realize now that was me grasping for something that from them, like why do I need anything from this person to find forgiveness? In reality, closure comes, I think, from God and from ourselves. We don't need to ever understand another person's motives, what they were going through, why they did something. It's enough for you to just accept that it happened and move on. I think seeking closure opens the door to renewed resentments. But does anyone want to jump on that? Because I can see some very enthusiastic people agreeing. But if you have thoughts to add, because I think it's a trap. It's a trap the devil sets up. This idea of like wanting closure from an ex-boyfriend or ex-partner, or wanting closure from an old friend who's like lost contact with you for whatever reason. It just seems like, well, why open it up if you've moved on? Why go back to that place? Yeah, but I'm not sure if anyone has a different opinion or greater wisdom to share. It took me a long time to get to that point. I did not have Arsenios's wisdom of being able to just bygones be bygones. Took me a lot longer to get there. I think in that case, the silence suggests we may all be in agreement on that, closure is something. I brought it up because I know that I've had a conversation with many friends recently, and I think it can be definitely a trap we fall into. And I thought it's worth bringing up that closure is not necessary for forgiveness. If anything, I think closure is a part of unpicking your own wounds and not healing. So definitely worth making a note. That's pretty much it from me. I just want to thank everyone again. What a pleasure it was to join you this morning. And thank you so much for having me and inviting me to speak. And you're a really incredible bunch of people. It's always a pleasure hearing from everyone's their thoughts as well. So thank you for sharing during the discussion. And thank you, Christina, for inviting me. And Father, thank you for allowing me to participate today.